I am so proud to introduce you to Jessica Jackson and Megan Torrance of Torrance Learning. If you don't know who they are, you should. You should know about Torrance Learning. Definitely, I think it's torrancelearning.com if you want to learn more about Torrance Learning. They both spoke at our first community day, which took place a couple months ago. A great conversation there. I so admire what Megan and Jessica are doing in L&D, especially when it comes to DEI and just educating people on some more like social justice issues, and even educating me, because when they submitted their title and their content for what they were going to be talking about, I had never even heard about intersectionality. And then I looked it up. I'm like, whoa, okay, here we go. This is great. So I'm so happy to have them here. You guys enjoy, and thank you so much for being here, Megan and Jessica.
Absolutely. Well, and thanks for calling us and for having us. And it's so good to kind of see some people. Actually, Heather, I was reminded that I was in Torrey Pines this time 5 years ago, exactly today. So hello, community. We love you. I have posted out in the chat some of the resources and things that we'll talk about today, including a resource guide, and then there's also things over at our space in the arena that you can go and grab if all those went a little bit too fast. But I am going to hope like crazy that screen share is going to work successfully for me here. And let's get started. So I am going to we're going to start today talking about intersectionality and what that means. And it's not, it has nothing to do with traffic. Jess, do me a favor. Can you see that we are sharing screen, or I am sharing screen?
Yep, you are presenting your screen, Megan. Looks great.
Fantastic, which means I can't see chat, and that's a one downside. So Jess is the woman on chat. I am the woman on PowerPoint. So real quick, and I don't want to talk too fast to try to make up time, but I also don't want to bump the people right after us. So I'm Megan Torrance. Everybody, welcome. And at Torrance Learning, we spend a lot of time on learning strategy, on learning design, on learning engineering and software implementation and development. We also spend a lot of time on professional development and helping to uplift our community. And it started out with Agile and Llama and project management. It then went to XAPI and the XAPI learning cohort. And recently we have added to that what we call cultivating racial equity in the workplace, or CREW. And so this is a part of that. And as we talk about intersectionality, and our history and how we approach this, right? So I grew up in the 80s, right? I was unleashed on the professional world in the 90s, and I didn't want to be treated as a woman in business. I didn't want any free passes because I was a woman. I wanted to be treated as an equal, right? And so I spent a lot of time trying to stamp out any identities of mine that were different from the male norm, right? As though it were obvious that I'm a woman, right? So clearly I had a ton to learn. I was also taught at the time that talking about race was not polite. So we didn't talk about it. I clearly had a lot to learn. Because what I'm learning is that our identities, right, are part of who we are. It's how we show up at work and how we show up in our communities. And that's part of my journey. And Jess and I are going to talk about that a little bit today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Jess. I like to say I'm a community architect with heart. Everything I do is driven by my community. I hold a lot of identities that have been on the margins historically, right? I'm a Black, fat, queer woman, and I navigate spaces very differently than Megan. And so this conversation is really fun to have with her. I think that we both bring in our own lived experiences, and we welcome you into that space today. And it's facilitated by both of us intentionally. I have a lot of expertise and experience in DEI strategy. I've worked directly in classrooms supporting underrepresented students. I've worked at the strategic level in academia, designing strategy to support underrepresented students in their success. And I am also very engaged in our crew development, right? And so today's conversation is really centered on how we bring all of us into the workplace and what that means for us from different lenses, right? I come from a very marginalized lens, or Megan might come from a very privileged lens. And we want to hold space for both of those perspectives because that's what has to happen. We have to be able to center all of those experiences in our work. So welcome. Thanks for being here with us today. And I'm going to pass it back over to you, Megan. Let's hop in.
Sure thing. Let's hop in. So today's conversation, just give us the lay of the land for our conversation today.
Yeah. I realized I spoke too soon. Yeah, today we have three big goals for you. We want to be able to explore identity as a concept and give you a framework and a resource that you can do that with yourself and with your teams. We want to be able to discuss the concept of intersectionality, and I really appreciate that Louise owned that he didn't know what that was, right? He hadn't heard of that before this conversation, and I'm glad that we're able to hold space for that and learn together. And then we want to talk about how we can sort of combat and challenge bias and microaggression using something called microaffirmation. So we'll talk through what that looks like, how that affects our colleagues and one another. And that is what we want to talk about today.
And you know, I think it's important to note that we're not talking about what you do in your DEI, your diversity, equity, and inclusion courses. We're talking about what we do as learning and development professionals in every learning experience we build, because we actually have a really, really unique opportunity and a leadership role in our organizations because we touch every single employee, and many times we touch every single customer, every single channel partner, and we have that opportunity and that call actually to be the very best face of our organizations in that work that we do. And so that's really what we're all about here today. Today may be uncomfortable. I will tell you, coming from, as Jess acknowledged, a place of great privilege, this can be very uncomfortable, some of these conversations. And I want you to lean into that if you are someone who feels like this may be uncomfortable for you, because that's how we learn. So while this learning edge isn't necessarily comfortable, we do want to create a safe space. And actually, that's what I love about TLDC, is that this is a safe space as a community. And when we do this, Jess, can we talk about some of the norms that in this work we create to create that safe space for growth?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of meta here, right, Megan? When we're talking about holding space for conversations we haven't historically had, we're going to be on that learning edge, right? And so when you might be leading this with your teams, with your colleagues, with your boss, you need to acknowledge how those emotions are gonna come up, right? And so a good exercise to have with your team and with whoever you're sharing space with is to set some norms. Like, what are the expectations that we need in order to feel safe? So take this activity and you can come up with your own norms, but some that we like to start with are acknowledging your triggers. Own the fact that this is emotional work, and those triggers come back. Pay attention to when they come up. Pay attention to why they came up. That's some exploration that can be doing to grow in your competence around DEI. And we like to add belonging on there as well. This is a conversation that's going to widen our lenses, right? When we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about how we have multiple social identities that shape experience. And there are things we might not even know or understand. Megan and I were talking about in the 80s how she didn't want to acknowledge her different identities. And I said, but Megan, I'm Black. I can't erase that. Like, I can't take that away. So when I come in, there's no way for me to soften that, right? And so then also acknowledging that because we're all coming from different places, we're all at different levels, we want to navigate that difference respectfully. So as we're in, is probably not the best place to to have a debate about some social issue. And so just respecting one another and how we navigate those differences are going to be some norms that we uphold today.
And I think some of the other norms that as Jess mentioned, chat, if it does get too heated, and if it rarely does, but if it does get too heated, feel free to close your internet window and come back at the next one. Jess and I will not be offended, and give yourself the space and the care to do that, by all means. So given this, let's jump in here. Let's talk about social identities.
So I love that you all are reacting. And so I hope that we all have some sort of framework for social identity, but give me a reaction if you're familiar with the term social identity, you know what social identities are. And if not, we're going to talk about them in the context of this conversation. Thank you all for those reactions. They're social categories that identify people in relationship to one another. Okay, so they're groupings and categorizations. And this is expansive and it grows daily because our lived experiences are being treated with different nuance, right? So I have a friend who is trans and is an elder who is trans, and they didn't have that language for themselves back in the 80s when they were navigating their experience. So some things about social identity is that they can change, right? They're not static. You might be born with a certain social identity. You might be born into a certain socioeconomic class. And as you have economic mobility, that changes, right? And social identity is something that grows as you gain more self-awareness and self-acceptance, which sometimes can be hard when there are some social identities that have been historically centered and held at the center. Social identity plays a role in the level of influence and access that we have, because there are certain social identities that have been upheld and some that have been disenfranchised, marginalized, and excluded. The power differential makes social identity something that is an experience, right? It's something that can be felt. There are times when things resonate because of that experience, and there are times when things might be less salient because you're not experiencing it in the same way. And social identity groupings have compounded impact. And that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about intersectionality, compounded impact. It means I might have a completely different experience in a setting as a Black queer woman, as Megan might have in that same setting. And we're going to talk through that. So, and I want you to know that social identities are a way that we relate to one another.
So let's dig in. This is in the downloadable that you've got. But I'm going to ask, given our time, why don't you follow along with Jess and I, and then you'll have an opportunity to do this yourself and with your teams in your sheet, right? So we have a set of social identities, and we use this. Jess and I use this to our workshops to frame up the rest of the conversation. So I've got a little snippet of it here, and I'm going to fill in for me my group membership, right? So I am born female. I identify as a woman. I am white. Honestly, before Jessica did this much, I really didn't think about my ethnicity much, except that I call myself IKEA Swedish. I am heterosexual. I am a non-practicing Episcopal. I am upper middle. I am 50, which now makes me the subject of a Saturday Night Live joke. Right, but I'm solidly Gen X, and I am out of shape after a pandemic, but I am able-bodied. What am I aware of, right? So then I go through and we think about, right, which of these identities, right, am I aware of? I am recently, because I turned 50, I'm aware of that. And it's today in a conference on women in L&D, I'm pretty aware of this. I don't often have to think about, gosh, many of these, right? I don't notice a lot. How do others think of me? Gosh, as a woman, right? That affects how others creates access to me. Absolutely. I have lots of access. And what creates barriers for me? I have very few barriers. Sometimes in the past, being a woman has created a barrier for me, but I really am not in a spot where I experience many barriers in my life. Okay. So let's take a look at how this could look differently.
Yeah, so the way that I experience social identity, I identify as a cis woman, right? I like that everybody is, I often say if trans women aren't included, I don't want a part of it. I am multiracial, Black. I am American. I identify as queer, spiritual. I am now solidly middle class. I am a millennial.
You ruined everything, Jess.
Or did we make it better? And I am temporarily able-bodied. And I say temporarily because our ability status can shift in any moment. I am most acutely aware of my queer identity. I think as a millennial and someone who's in middle class, I think about my social class because of my debt load quite frequently. I also think about my race a lot. So I'm very aware of that. The things that I think about least are maybe, I would say like my gender identity, although I also identify as fluid. So that's something that is coming up for me as I navigate my experience in social identity. And that affects how other people think of me. I think my race definitely affects how other people think of me. I think my sexual orientation affects how other people think of me. And my age affects how people think of me. I think being American, especially being queer and American, I was able to marry my wife here. It gives me lots of access and privilege. And I would say that most of my identities have created barriers for me. Specifically being a woman, being Black, being queer, being a millennial. And so my experience navigating the world is very different than Megan's. And when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to think about how one's lived experience really does affect people's experience at work, their interactions with one another, and how you show up. So, and again, I want to go back to social identities are how you relate to one another, right? So this is all about relationships.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, it's everybody comes at this from, right, everybody's going to fill this out differently, right? The ones where you're most disadvantaged are the ones that you're most aware of, right? The ones where you are most advantaged are where you're likely to have blind spots, right? And I will say the ones where you are most advantaged are where you have the most power to make change and create access for other people, right? And these different identity measures are going to drive different needs. Just for the interest of time, I think we have these questions in our downloadable for the for debriefing this with your team. What guidance would you give though to team leaders?
I would say that when you're exploring this, and we have some good questions in chat that I want to address. I would say when you're debriefing conversations like this with your team, if your team doesn't have high level of interpersonal rapport and psychological safety, it's probably not a good idea to just hop into conversations around identities, social identity, and the way that they create access and barriers, right? Maybe we can start talking about cultural differences. We can start talking, we can ease our way to this conversation, or you can hire a trained facilitator that can do that with your team to help them navigate that. I do think that this is a great way for your team to start to address any blind spots that you might be having at work, right? If you have a mostly privileged team, they might be not thinking about some of those identities that are creating barriers, or even thinking about how identity create barriers. So I had someone ask a question around neurotypical folks and how that plays into social identity. So remember, we talked about social identity is exhaustive and continuing to grow. I mean, non-exhaustive and continues to grow. You can add any categorization that you want to this tool. And you can also account for neurodiversity within ability status, if that's something that you're doing, or you can grow your list. So I appreciate that you named that aspect of identity. I also have questions around nationality and ethnicity, and I really appreciate that one called that out. I am ethnically Black in America. I don't know my ethnicity, right? So that's something to think about as I hold space. My ancestors, I don't know where they came from. So I identify my ethnicity with where I am now. And so yes, American is a nationality, but as a Black American, I don't have access to my ethnic background. And so I think that that's a way that you can see privilege come out in ways. Some folks asked about the difference between race and ethnicity. So I have a friend who is Nigerian American, who racially is Black, right, in our context, but they are not ethnically, they are Nigerian. And there's a very key difference there. So there's a key difference in that experience of social identity around race and ethnicity. So that makes it not repetitive. And when we think about intersectionality, that's how we nuance the conversation. So thank you all for bringing in these questions, and I can't wait to connect hopefully after this.
These are deep questions. So Jess and I, we have this thing at Torrance Learning, right? The quality of the questions is an indicator of connection with the content and the ideas. So I love these questions. This is awesome. We are having a fantastic conversation. Jess, we've got 10 minutes. Let's talk about intersectionality.
All righty. All right. So the key to intersectionality is a framework that addresses the complexity of multiple social identities, right? So we know that our historically centered social identities have a different experience than those that have been marginalized, right? It's important to know that the term intersectionality started with Black women to demonstrate and express the kind of double compounded marginalization that they receive both as Black and women. It was Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a Black feminist academic, who first coined the term in 1989. She was using it to talk about legal discrimination that Black women were facing, and wanted to provide a framework for folks to understand. Since this term has shifted over time, and folks have used it to explain how different people in different identity groups and within same identity groups might experience identity differently, right? So if I were a a white woman who is queer versus I am a white woman who is straight, we would have different intersectional experiences. So it just allows us to broaden the perspective of how we're centering and talk about social identity. The critique here is that we want to continue to hold those with the most marginalized identities at the center, right? So specifically, this term was coined by Black women, and when we think about using it, we want to honor that legacy and not appropriate it in different texts.
So what we just got the opportunity to experience was all of the academic lusciousness that is Jess Jackson. And I say that with amazing respect, because she brings such depth to this and helps me frame the experiences that I have, right? So last summer, I was leading a conversation about women's leadership, right? And the group happened to be all white women. And we can go into all the reasons why. That was not accidental, not intentional on my part, but not accidental if you think about the structures in our society. But this group is all white women, rising executives or business owners, right? So leaders. And this got said. Right? Think about, right, what is implied here by social identities, right? Think about who is being centered and who is being marginalized, right? Who are we leaving out when this is the predominant question, right? So when we're looking at applying an intersectional perspective in our work, right? We can, right? And I can, right? As someone who is historically centered, I can be the one saying whose experience is being represented here and who is not being considered, right? Most of us, if we show up for an event labeled like this is today, would look at a panel of speakers or a panel of experts in our e-learning courses and be able to say, wow, that is not a good mix of men and women. Woo-wee, right? But we need to be looking at the other intersections, right? And the other perspectives that that we need to make sure get displayed and lifted up, right? And a lot of times people say, well, how do we make sure this isn't just tokenism? How do we make sure, right? The way you make sure it's not tokenism is by having more than one, right? And considering some of those overlapping identities and not just having one person on each that represents it. And I've also had people like concerned that they will overrepresent, even in a positive way, but overrepresent marginal identities, right? Think about what has been overrepresented historically. That wasn't a problem, right? Well, it was a problem, but what I want to encourage you to center on the identities that have been historically underrepresented and bring those to light, and push that in the work that you're doing. And the more that you do, the less risky that becomes. So as we look here today, I'd like to kind of leave us on a positive thing that we can all adopt and be doing, whether we're leaders or not, right? To be able to counteract structures of racism, counteract kind of singular monolithic approaches to things, and even implicit bias, right? Jess, let's talk about microaffirmation.
Yeah, and this is one of my favorite ways to counteract that microaggression that we might experience in the workplace. And so maybe not, but let me know, give me a reaction if you know what a microaggression is. Some people call them the death by 1,000 cuts. They're not small by any stretch of the word. Don't let micro fool you. They actually have compounded psychological impact, and they're constant indignities that folks with marginalized social identities experience regularly. The top two that I've experienced are right on the next screen, right? Being told that I am articulate constantly, or being pointed to the low-fat dessert section or the diet food. Those are microaggressions because they are ways that folks have lower expectations of my performance and the way that I show up in spaces, right? And they also are ways that folks try to regulate me. So when we're thinking about microaggressions, we're really thinking about ways that we take away from the human dignity that folks from marginalized identities should be experiencing every day. And one way to counteract them is to apply microaffirmations.
And oh yeah, keep going.
No, go ahead, Megan.
So microaffirmation is that positive injection that everybody, including leaders who set the stage, can do, right? We are validating actual lived experiences, valuing people as individuals. We're affirming social identity instead of marginalizing social identity, right? Talk about how race intersects your work, right? And that the really being able to talk about that and normalize that, and normalizing celebration and encouragement of everybody, and realizing that nobody's in this alone, and nobody has to tamp down their ideas in order to be a part of that team, right? And one of our values at work, one of our core values is generous collaboration, right? We all have something to offer a situation, and that's the our going in position, our default is that. So this also, right, microaffirmation also has to do with how we create a safe space for feedback and a place where we can both positively and critically support each other and our growth. I am guessing, Jess, that we've got some questions in the in the chat that we may want to address, or that may be being addressed by everybody else. And I'm actually going to stop screen sharing here so that we can do any last bit of talking, or bring Luis back in as well to the conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to say 10 more minutes. That's cool with you guys.
Oh, 10 more minutes.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
thank you so much. This is so amazing. I'm like blown away. You
And
guys
you was like trying to bring you back on schedule.
Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of folks sharing their own stories. I really appreciate you sharing and voicing and naming your experiences with microaggressions. Thank you for that vulnerability and that honesty there. Folks sharing stories about their in the workplace. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in that. I appreciate this big one. Jessica, as a multiracial Black woman, how do you deal with the pushback in our community when bringing up the need to bring trans women into conversations surrounding issues that we face? I see a lot of my Black cis straight women. I appreciate that, Kristen. And I think, I hope Kristen or Christine, let me know. I think that the Black community, as a Black person, I can say this. The Black community has a lot of work to do when it comes to LGBT inclusion. And a lot of it stems from our own marginalization and what we have to do in order to perform and be seen as valuable. I recognize the harm and the history there. I think I have it a little easier because I am queer. So in order for folks to love and access me, they need to be open and receptive to my community. And I always push back like, but you love a queer person. And so I personalize it a lot. Is my response. And then I also bring up like powerful leaders over time who are queer, like Bayard Rustin, right? Like, or other folks that we lean on to showcase. And then I also think it's about sharing space. How do we make space for other perspectives so that we can start centering those voices and uplifting those voices? Whether that means you're hosting an event, how do we make sure that we bring trans women in those events and make sure their voices are heard?
I'm going to kind of riff off Tori's comment, right? We white gals, we have a lot of homework to do to be true allies, and we have to do the work ourselves. Actually, we're doing a book club at work, Ijeoma Oluo's book, so you want to talk about race? It's a really good book. And our entire team is working through this together. Jess is hosting a book club, but it's a great place to start, actually. And it's got lots of references, so where to go next, I think. But we have a lot of homework to do. We have a lot of access. Remember, that identity gives us access to be able to reach in and say, hey, so with, and to make that space. So Luis, with the community day was it just last month? Luis reached out to me and said, hey, Megan, will you speak on community day? I said, yeah. And you know who I'm bringing along with me is Jessica, right? And so we have a job to do. And sometimes it's to bring along and sometimes it's to get out of the way.
Mm-hmm. Megan, I'm going to ask you this one. What can be done when the decision makers are not open to have these kinds of conversations in the workplace?
Oh boy, that's a good, hard question. It depends on your workplace. It depends on your workplace. If your workplace has a human resources function, then that is absolutely where to go to get allies and support, right? So if you want to have this conversation, they can often support you there. The other way to have this conversation is as fired up as you may be, right, to come alongside and help them grow. So think about any leader in your organization. Maybe they're not a great coach of others. Maybe they don't have the technical skills that they need to, right? Hitting them on the head with it is not a great way to bring them along in this space. So we talked about neurodivergence. I recently was in a discussion where the comment was somebody was asking for images on for autism awareness month, and everybody's responding with blue ribbons and puzzle pieces and all sorts of things that the autistic community it kind of makes the hair on the back of their neck stand up, right? It is, and so rather than say, "Oh, you idiots, this isn't how we do it now," actually came alongside with hey, you know what? I've done a lot of work as my autistic daughter has gotten older. Here's some resources that you can go to pursue. Here's the short version of it. Here is, some things I learned along the way. And so I'm normalizing that learning as a positive process.
Mm-hmm. I would also add data. How can we get data about the experiences of folks in your workplace? Anything that points to what's going on and exposing that this is a real issue. And I really do appreciate Tori. Tori brought up, like, it's not the work of folks with marginalized identities to do the uplifting and educating. Megan and I have this conversation consistently. I think sometimes it looks like, oh, a Black woman is leading this racial equity work, but this is what my degree is in. Like, this is what I've been doing for the last 15 years. This is what I want to be doing. This is what sparks my fire. But you're absolutely right. Don't tokenize folks of color to do DEI work, and don't put it on us to do the work for you. You got to go through and learn and do your own work in order to create change.
There are so many good things in the conversation. All right, do we need to let's see. Oh, great. Tori's sharing some books. All right.
Mm-hmm. Back us up.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Luis for inviting us. I'd like to thank the entire community. I know there's a gigantic crew of volunteers behind the scenes who are making this work. And to the questions about the resources and tool sheets were shared at the top of this chat for this session, which is now fabulously long. But also, if you go over to either email us and we'll do it for you, right? You can email us, or I just added that to the Q&A. That's not super helpful. Or over at the in the arena at the Torrance Learning booth, we have the downloadables as well.
Awesome.
So, Lisa, thank you.
Hey guys, just thank you so much for having an impact. L&D has always been kind of a strange place for me. Like, I think I got in like in around 2004, 2005. And, outside of Ray Jimenez, I think he's the only other Filipino I'd ever seen at a conference. And so I was felt a little out of place. I actually feel like, Torrance Learning is already a leader in the space. And for you to be, to kind of spearheading a lot of helping educate people in these initiatives is just huge. It's absolutely amazing. So I just want to thank you for doing that. And I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I will champion Torrance Learning, forever. So just keep me posted if you need help with anything. And
Thanks, Luis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
all right,
everyone.
guys, I'm going to wrap it up a little bit. We've got Carolyn Hain is coming up in the next. She's doing a mini session talking about her journey. And then we've only got a couple more left today. It's been crazy long, but thanks for hanging in there with us. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye, everybody.
Bye.